Today, we're talking all about weather.
Starting to even look like a triple rainbow.
No, not that kind. Welcome back to the Scale Builders Guild. Thanks again for watching. Today we're doing one of the videos that has been most requested by my viewers, and that is weathering. And weathering, to me, is one of the most amazing ways that you can make your truck really unique and really stand out, and most importantly, make it look even more realistic. Most of my trucks in the past have been weathered using most of these techniques, and today I'm going to share 4 with you that will really help take your trucks to that next level. If you have ideas for other videos and other how-tos you would like to see from the Scale Builders Guild, by all means, post down in the comments below. I'd love to get your feedback. So let's dive right into it right away, not waste any time on my ugly face. For the purposes of this video, I created 5 identical styrene sheets that had a strip down the middle to give you a contour so you could see how each of these weathering techniques affects styrene and how it looks on an angle. It's important to kind of show off what the truck is going to look like using a template like this one, which is just a styrene sheet that I primed and painted with titanium silver from Tamiya. You can see that just having that angle on there is really going to be able to show us how these techniques are going to work and how they're going to look. So that's your base, that's your sort of your control, if you will. If you're into science, you might know what that means. But that's sort of our control, and I'll be comparing this panel to the weathered panels so we get an idea of how much they've changed. The first technique that I want to share is probably the simplest one of all of these, and that is washes. A wash is usually made by taking an acrylic paint, preferably a flat paint, and diluting it with thinner. It's usually around a 10-to-1 ratio, and what you're going to find is that this wash, once applied to a body, is going to find all of the crevices and all the cracks and all the contours and kind of load up those areas with some color. Now obviously you can make your own washes at home. It's super easy to do. For the purposes of this video, I decided to use washes that I already had on hand from Vallejo. These are excellent washes. They come in a variety of different colors and different in intensities and purposes. The ones I'm using today for panel number 1, it's really designed to sort of fill in those gaps and to take, you should start with a khaki or a green colored truck for this wash specifically, but I found it works really well on any number of colors to give it that really kind of dirty and used look. So really quite simply, just apply it with a brush. And you will find that it kind of shows the brush strokes at first, but if you leave it and let it dry, you will find that it does a great job of filling in those gaps and filling those contours with a nice bit of color. And it really kind of looks grimy and dirty and used, and there isn't really much you need to do beyond that to get that finish. And it's a pretty spectacularly easy way to really weather a truck quickly. Yeah, that's sort of the first one. Very simple and very effective. And like I said, it's something that you can do at home with existing paint, provided you've got some acrylic thinner. It's really a very simple process, and really, I think, looks quite fantastic. As you can see, it doesn't require much effort to really change the look of that panel. One to the control panel to the weathered panel, you can see there's a very big difference. And for me, weathering starts with a simple process like using a wash. The second technique that I wanted to share with you is airbrushing. Now, this of course requires a little more effort and a little more expense on your part to start with, But trust me, once you have an airbrush and you've gotten some experience using it, it will be something you use all the time. It's a really fantastic way to add some dust and some grime and some dirt in areas that, you know, you wouldn't want to touch with a paintbrush because it's going to show off those brush strokes. For this example, I used a wash again of a mix of Flat Earth from Tamiya and Vallejo Model Wash for Rust. Of course, you can make up your own washes at home. Like I said, this was just for the sake of convenience and speed. I wanted to show off as many techniques as possible in the shortest amount of time. So very lightly use your airbrush on the sort of the minimum setting for the minimum amount of paint coming out of it, and just apply in sort of the contours and the areas in which you want to show off some additional dirt or grime. And now on this panel, because I used the rust, I thought let's also go back and do a full wash on the whole thing and also use some pigments. These pigments are from MIG, and they go on really, really well. You can use them wet, you can use them dry, and you can apply a wash after the fact to kind of move that pigment around. Ultimately, it gives a really nice muddled, muddy, dusty look. And on this panel, I also added a few rust bits with some Vallejo weathering effects. This is environment effects, and it's called rust texture, and it's almost like the consistency of mud. When it goes on, it does go on a bit thick. You can also go back and thin that out afterwards with a little thinner on a very thin brush. Just gives it that sort of weathered and rusty appearance without having to do a ton of work in the rust realm. And we're going to get into rust on the next two panels. Those are very cool. This effect might be a little extreme. I would say that if it's a dusty, dirty, maybe even it depends on the soil and the condition that you want to sort of showcase this truck in. This definitely works. It's a little more extreme than you might anticipate, and it might be a little too much for your purposes, but it is another way of showing age, and that's sort of the important thing here, is to show age. That's what weathering is all about. Let's go on to technique number 3, which I call salting. Salting is definitely one of my more preferred techniques. It's a really interesting look, and it adds a lot of texture, and texture is something that is really difficult to do in our scale because it always kind of looks a little bit weird. But with this technique, it's really easy to bring life and actual depth to your rusting or weathering techniques. So you'll notice that this panel here, instead of starting with the titanium silver that I've used in the other examples, I painted this with some red and brown paint to simulate what sort of a base coat or a rust coat might look like on a truck. Now, where the salt comes into play is in this next step. You want to wet down that panel after the paint is dried, obviously, and apply quite liberally as much table salt as you can. What the salt is going to do is it's going to stick to the areas that are wet, and once that dries, you're going to go back and hit it with your final color. The final color, in this case titanium silver, gets applied. The salt still sticks to where you put it, and then once the titanium silver is dried, you go in and rinse it off with some warm water. What you're left with is this pockmarked, rusty looking surface that has texture and depth. And once you apply a few washes or a little bit of rust texture from Vallejo, you're left with this really convincing technique where it looks as if the paint has actually been eaten away by the rust underneath, and the rust is really coming through. This is one of my favorite techniques. I think it looks fantastic, and it's super easy to accomplish. Just remember when you're doing it that you should only rust areas that are going to get hit by that kind of rust in the elements as a truck actually would. Keep that in mind when you're doing it. It's really important to kind of think this part through and not assault it with salt. See what I did there? Okay, on to the next technique. This final technique is the most intensive, but for me offers the best results over time. It's not going to look perfect at first, but give it a few months and this will be your favorite rusting technique, weathering technique, I promise you. What we're using to achieve this effect is Sophisticated Finishes rusting system. What this system is an actual iron filing based paint and a rust activator. The idea here is to take our panel and liberally apply the iron based paint. You want to put it on in a very thick coat. The idea here is to make sure you've got a nice base layer that will eventually rust and actually leach through the paint. So what we want to do is put on a very nice thick coat, and once that's dry, we're going to come back and use the activator. The activator is essentially just an acid. I just use vinegar now. Simple distilled vinegar will work magically. We apply our vinegar also quite liberally, let that sit for a few hours, and it will magically come back rusty. And hey, we could leave it right there. That's basically the technique, and you could be done and have a totally rusty truck. In that state, that technique would be fine for a rat rod, say, but let's say we still want to have some paint and we want to have the rust come through that paint afterwards. We're going to need to continue on in the steps. That next step is to prime with a simple white paint. It can be flat, can be glossy, doesn't really matter. Put on a nice layer of that, not too thick. And then once that's dried, put our final titanium silver color on top. And of course, you can use whatever color you want. I just use titanium silver for the purposes of this demonstration. Once that paint is dried, and make sure it's dried and cured all the way through before you start doing the next step, get yourself some 400 grit sandpaper and start to very, very carefully sand through your layers of paint to reveal the rusted iron paint underneath. Take your time with this step and don't do it liberally. Do it as conservatively as possible, because wherever you sand away those layers of paint, that rust is going to come through. So you don't want rust everywhere, you want rust in certain places. This works great around rocker panels and fenders and edges and anywhere you want that rust to show through. Keeping in mind, of course, you want it to sort of be where rust would be. It's always great to look on the internet and get some examples so you know what real world rust looks like and how it works. Once you've done that sanding, it's a time to apply another layer of the vinegar, because what's going to happen is that vinegar is going to leach through the layers, find that rust paint, and start to bring it up and bring that actual rust through the layers of paint. I've also added a few scratches here with a blunt number 11 Excel hobby blade. It's just a nice kind of addition, and it just adds to the look and, you know, kind of makes it look even more weathered. I did this technique on my Land Cruiser half track, and it worked phenomenally well there. This is something that, now that you've done this, anytime you get the truck wet, anytime it's humid, anytime you go out anywhere where there's a liquid environment, it's going to continue to rust on its own. This is why I think this technique is so cool, because it becomes alive. It actually becomes, you know, a truck that will rust and change and develop over time. It's really kind of cool to see that happen, and it's very rewarding to know that this technique isn't that complicated and really makes your truck that much more original. It's such a fun way to change your truck, and I highly recommend this technique. It's very cool, very fun. So here's all 5 panels laid out. You can see how it goes from untreated to the different variations of weathering through these 4 techniques. It's really cool to see how these sorts of things come together, and it's been really fun for me to be able to share these things with you. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell anytime you want to see new content from the Scale Builders Guild. Also, don't forget that we have merchandise available on our Teespring site. Shirts, mugs, flags, sweatshirts, whatever you're into, we've got something for you. Be sure to check that out. I'll put the link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.